Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and you're in for a treat today because I'm in for a treat today. And the reason we're all in for a treat is we have author Jack Woodville London to join us. Jack has a fascinating professional career, and even more importantly, he writes novels about Texas history. I can't think of a better person to talk to than someone who writes novels about Texas history. So, Jack, with that incredibly long winded introduction, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the visit.
Could you tell us your professional background?
I trained as a lawyer and I practiced courtroom law for over 50 years. I know I don't look that old, but it'll gray you if you do it that long. Most of my courtroom work was associated with aviation accident and crash cases. All of that arose out of my attachment to my helicopter pilot from the Vietnam War, who was himself the victim of a helicopter crash. And I went to work for him and his family, and it immersed me into that part of my profession.
Where'd you
And
practice?
yes, sir.
Where was your practice?
In the United States, I live in Austin, Texas. My my host court record is the Texas Bar Association, but I've tried cases all over the country. I've been blessed to go to several foreign countries and work on cases there. It has taken me a lot.
That's a pretty specialized bar, not just the aviation bar, but the helicopter aviation bar.
It is.
I knew a few guys that were in the smaller plane bar, and they all knew each other and did
Sure.
what you did, traveled all over the country and indeed all over the world. Whether it didn't matter which side they were on, they were all good friends. Was that
Yeah.
your experience as well?
That is my experience. Did a lot of work with assistant U.S. attorneys, and we found them to be obliged to follow orders, but very competent and gracious men and women who I'm proud to say they represented the United States well. And the defense lawyers that worked for the large firms that represented the helicopter companies and the aviation insurance industry, with only one exception that we won't talk about, were really good men and women. It was a great way to have a career.
So you are a continuing student at Oxford University. Could you tell me about your Oxford experience?
In 2014, I discovered that I was eligible to go to continuing adult education in Oxford. And I applied, it was accepted. I was immediately assigned to creative writing courses. Those were not my first creative writing courses, I'm happy to say. But I took 4 years of creative writing and then reverted to my undergraduate major, which is medieval history. And I discovered along the way that what I really learned how to do as both a lawyer and an undergrad student was research. Research is central to everything a courtroom lawyer has to do, digging out facts that people often don't know. And digging out facts of history is just fascinating. Most of us go through public school systems where we begrudgingly learn a few names and a few dates and a few episodes. We know the American Revolution, we know the Civil War, we've heard of World War II, but very few of us actually know any of the details, either of what happened in those events or of what caused people to do what they did. And so it became sort of natural to lend itself to creative writing. I've pursued that and will be back in Oxford beginning in about 10 days.
So we're going to talk about your book, Dangerous Latitudes, but what are some of the other books you have written?
The first book I wrote was in the sixth grade. It was an entire plagiarism of a book that riveted me as a boy called The Red Car. That was the name of the book that I loved. It was the story of a boy in a very small town where a wreck happened to a red sports car, and the owner walked away from it, and the boy and the local mechanic put it back together, drove it, and had adventures. My first book was about a small town boy in which there was a wreck of a sports car, and that boy and his friendly mechanic put the car back together and had small town adventures. And I think it was probably 15 pages long, and I saw it somewhere in my house the other day. But not until 2009 was I able to learn enough about the creative writing process to persuade someone to publish my first novel, book one of a three-book trilogy called the French Letters series. And it is a series that has a small town Texas story of a woman who is waiting through World War II for the man she loves to come home from England in the European theater. We're not clear which of two brothers that man is. The second book is the parallel story told at the same time by one of those two brothers. And the second book, the parallel story, is called Engaged in War. It was the book that gave me the title Author of the Year in 2012. And then the third book in the series was Children of a Good War, which, as you may imagine, is the story of the children of that couple, the man in France and the woman in Texas, told in the 1980s as they are both post war veterans from Vietnam. And not surprisingly, it's a story of sibling rivalry. So I was blessed that was the 2019 Military Novel of the Year for the United States.
Where did you grow up?
In Groom, Carson County, near Amarillo, Texas.
All right.
Have you ever heard of it?
I have not. I've heard of Amarillo.
Yeah. Groom now is in the neighborhood of about 300 people. It's 40 miles from Amarillo, 30 miles from Pampa, and everybody in Groom knows it's 15 from Claude and White Deer and not too far away from Lee Fords and Clarendon. The same families that live there today, you can find their names in the high school journals from the 1910s and 1920s. It's a wheat town.
Let me talk to you about your writing process
Okay,
because we have a few things in common. I'm a recovering trial lawyer.
I'm so sorry.
Uh,
I'm
yeah.
glad you're recovering.
Yes. I've written a lot of nonfiction work. In the last area of my practice, which is anti corruption compliance, business ethics, leadership,
Yes.
corporate culture, those sorts of things. And I have attempted to write fiction unsuccessfully. But when I do write, I find that the story literally plays out in my head, and I almost feel like I'm recording it as I see it. What is your process for writing fiction?
There's a fascinating article. I probably can't find it anymore between two Canadian authors, Jan Martel and who's the fellow who wrote The English Patient. It'll take me longer to find it on the shelf. But those two men discussed what you're asking. Do you outline the entire article, the entire novel, chapter by chapter, and then paragraph by paragraph, and then sentence by sentence, and then finally string them all together? Or in the other case, do you write them as a stream of consciousness, what my friend Joe Badal calls seat of the pants writing? Mine probably is somewhere between the two of those, and I suspect yours is as well. When I have an idea for a novel, I have to pursue it to find out if there's actually a story. And where I usually discover the story is in the research that I do about the theme that I'm interested in. In this book that we're talking about today, I discovered in the 1840s that Mexico captured the Alamo two more times. They invaded San Antonio twice in the 1842 period, and they did it as revenge for Texas trying a really foolish attempt to persuade Santa Fe to join Texas. I thought there's got to be a story there. I mean, how many people do you know, Tom, who grew up in Texas, took Texas history, maybe even are Texas historians, had no idea that the Alamo was taken two more times, or that Santa Anna sent his armies to invade Texas two more times? How many people know that in the course of that, over 700 Texans, soldiers and businessmen, were captured and marched on foot to prisons in Veracruz, Mexico? So, somewhere in there, I saw the conflict that we never learned about in Texas history. You know, we're taught the conflict is Alamo, Goliad. We win at San Jacinto, and then 15, 20 years later, we become part of the Confederacy. And they jump over all of that in the middle. And I discovered it was an incredibly dangerous and violent place. And where this took me was to a study of what people thought Texas meant back at that time. If you close your eyes and think of the map of Texas, you have this thing that goes from the Sabine River to the Rio Grande, from the Gulf all the way up to Colorado and Oklahoma and New Mexico. The 1837 map of Texas ends at the Nueces River. It ends almost just north of present day San Antonio. Austin wasn't on the map, El Paso wasn't on the map. It was strung together by tiny little roads called the Caminos Real, the King's Highways. And every once in a while, it was dotted with little things on the map that Stephen F. Austin had put there to entice settlers to come to Texas. There are little marks on the map that say droves of wild horses, free ranging cattle. And in two places, he puts down silver mines. Here is a silver mine. And so that settlers would move into Texas, take free cattle, get free land grants, have their own silver mines, and they could even bring their slaves. But beyond the Nueces River, it said part of Coahuila, part of Tamaulipas. And just north of that, the entire thing that we call West Texas, the Western Hill Country, all the way to the Red River, all the way to the Rio Grande at El Paso, range of the Comanche. So we have the makings of an almost vacant land, crisscrossed by little tiny roads, barely populated with villages. San Antonio was less than 5,000 people, being invaded by Mexicans. It's not hard to come up with an idea for a story out of that. You just have to generate someone who would be foolish enough to go there. And so I began to work on creating a primary character who becomes my hero, a man named Alexander LeBranche, a map maker from Louisiana who gets kicked out of his father's ranch, his plantation, and told to go make his own way in the world. And he is deluded by Mirabeau B. Lamar, who says, "Why don't you come to Texas? Map the Rio Grande River for us. It's all ours," without telling him that Texas had not one stick of furniture, not one town, not one village, not a ranch, not a person west of San Antonio or west of the Nueces River. That's the structure. All I had to do then was learn the history and fill it in. And it only took me a little bit longer than it took to get my undergraduate degree. It took about 5 years.
So I was aware of the purported or attempted invasion of Santa Fe, but I had no idea that Mexico had twice captured San Antonio and the Alamo. And I've studied the Republic of Texas a fair amount. As I recall, it was Lamar who invaded Santa Fe. How do you assess Mayor B. Lamar
He
as
was a poet.
president of the Republic of Texas?
He was a poet. He was a heroic cavalryman at San Jacinto. He saved Thomas Rusk's life, and Sam Houston promoted him the next day to become a full colonel after one day of combat. But he was an absolute misogynistic idiot. The Santa Fe expedition is a very good example. He formed it over the objection of Congress that it refused to appropriate money for it. So when Congress went out of session, he simply went to the Treasury and took $75,000 out of the Texas Treasury to fund the organization of wagons, soldiers, and merchants that would go up to Santa Fe. And he wrote a letter to the people of Santa Fe saying, all you have to do is say yes to join us in the liberties that we enjoy here in Texas. He was just living in a dreamland that if he thought Santa Fe, still a city in Mexico, would surrender its ownership of the Santa Fe Trail and its mercantile success to join Texas, whose nearest town was 700 miles away, only someone who daydreamed could do that. He was a spendthrift, a dreamer, and then here's the bad part. The most menacing thing in any Texas experience was the perpetual chaos created by volatile Native Americans. The most volatile of them were probably the Comanche and the Kiowa. There were others. Mirabeau B. Lamar made it the policy of Texas to exterminate the Indians, as he put it. He never launched one attack on the Kiowa or the Comanche. He instead tried to exterminate the Cherokees, a peaceful, farming, literate group of nomads who lived in East Texas after their gradual displacement by the United States. So he is not in my pantheon of heroic people. Is that fair? I don't know, but it's my view.
I went to junior high school at Mirabeau B. Lamar Junior High School. So I've always had a place in my heart for him, also because he was, to his credit, I think, most insistent that the Republic of Texas have an educational system.
I agree.
And he was one of the early proponents that public education was a key to the long term success of the Republic.
I agree. He ordered the structure of the Texas free public education system and then funded it with money that Texas did not have. And so the system, we're probably still heirs of that system today. We could always use a little more funding for our public education system. But he truly was devoted to the idea of having education in all of these far flung places where the settlers had reached and settled.
I was also intrigued by, I would have called him prickly, and I think he was certainly that, but he did not get along with Sam Houston, nor did Sam Houston get along with him. And how Houston got term limited out, and Lamar came into office, and then he threw Lamar out, and he came back into the office.
Yes,
And so we had these wide swings of philosophy in the early years of the Republic. The, this, these battles and wars with Mexico during the life of the Republic, were they precursors to the US and Mexican War? Was it inevitable there was going to be a conflict after the United States became a state, or was it something different, in your opinion?
I think that there are four parties to the dance. There is Texas and Mexico, of course, but there also is England and the United States. And the United States did have this sensation of wanting to expand to the West. And during the annexation vote, it turned the phrase manifest destiny to occupy the shores all the way to the Pacific. England, however, wanted Texas to be an independent state so that it could have tariff free merchant relations with Texas cotton growing and also duty free relations to export things into Texas. Its ability to affect that dance was that Mexico had borrowed an enormous amount of money from English banks to finance its revolution against Spain between 1810 and 1821, and it paid very little of it back. So England was in a very good position to put pressure on Mexico to back away from Texas. And finally, believe it or not, just on the vote of annexation, the evening before the vote, Mexico agreed with England that it would recognize Texas independence on the condition that Texas not be annexed. Now, over on the United States side, the fight there was whether or not to allow Texas to be admitted because it would either be a slave state or it would not. Clearly, Texas was going to be a slave state. So there was early opposition to Texas becoming annexed, and it took some finessing by President John Tyler to get that not on the Senate ballot, but before the Congress as a committee of the whole to vote on it during the election of President Polk. Believe it or not, Tyler passed that ball to Polk. But once that happened, I think it was inevitable there would be the war with Mexico.
Do you think, because as I recall, when president in his first term, Sam Houston talked about England and talked about having relations with England. Do you think England saw Texas as potentially a buffer or at least some sort of check on the growth of the United States as
I do.
well?
I do. If you'll recall, at that stage of the Louisiana Purchase, the 42nd parallel that runs kind of from Chicago to Oregon was the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. Everything above that was uncertain. Was it Canada? Was it Great Britain on the Pacific Ocean? And England took the position that everything all the way down to the 42nd parallel was in fact British. England wanted to stop the United States from moving into territory that it thought was within its extraterritorial interests. And having Texas stop that in the short term was certainly a goal that would promote that limitation on United States growth.
How did you affect your research for this book? Were there primary sources in San Antonio? Did you have to go to Mexico? Or things housed at the Texas State Library that were primary sources for you? What were your sources for this book?
In this book in particular, I relied very heavily on research done at the Texas A&M University by a scholar named John Nance. I probably have 100 articles. And if you're listening to this and want to know how to do it, one program you should log into is JSTOR, JSTOR. And it's a search engine for academic articles. I probably have 100 JSTOR articles that have to do with the invasions of San Antonio, the range of the Comanches, the range of the Kiowas, the Battle of Lipan the Camino Real. But John Nance gave the big overview, that 3 volume set that is essential reading if you really want to know about the Republic of Texas.
Did Anson Jones play in your novel at all?
No, he did not. I chose not to include him because when you come to Texas, to the University of Texas from Groom, you have to drive to the town of Anson, and there's not much there. So I said, I'm not going to clutter this up.
Because I went to segregated schools, and my white junior high school was Mirabubi Lamar, and the Mexican junior high school was Anson Jones. So I grew up in Bryan. And then, of course, we all went to one high school.
Yep.
But how is this book going to lead to something else moving towards annexation and potentially the invasion? Because that military campaign is still one of the great military campaigns. And I mean, Winfield Scott's, but I suppose we should also give kudos to Zachary Taylor for his campaign. But the Winfield Scott campaign is, I still think, one of the most well recognized in U.S. military history.
So a short answer to that history is that to the extent that all of the figures in this book, the real characters, Pinckney Henderson, Thomas Rusk, Jack C. Hayes, all of these Texas historical figures were in that war. They were in Taylor's segment, not in Winfield Scott's segment. That's not 100% true, but it's close.
Right.
And they wound up in the northern part of the battle zone that mostly was Saltillo, Monclova, and then ultimately the Battle of Buena Vista. That they snatched victory out of defeat there. They were ready. The United States Army at Buena Vista was absolutely ready to be overrun by a vastly larger Mexican army with well supported ground troops and well supported artillery. And in the middle of the night of the day of battle, Santa Anna turned his troops around and retreated from the battlefield. I don't think there's a good explanation for that, but that's what happened. I concur with you that Winfield Scott's campaign was, it was like the invasion of Normandy. It was just masterful in its planning, execution, and creativity. Is there a book coming out of that? Maybe. I sure hate to leave those people where I left them at the end of Dangerous Latitudes. I like those people a lot.
Let me ask you about your relationship with Stony Creek Publishing. What was their role in assisting you in getting this book to print? What was it like for you working with Lauren and his team?
Not, I think if I tell it more or less chronologically, I'd like to do that. My
Okay.
literary agent in Denver discovered Stony Press, and when she reached out, she became acquainted with Leslie Barrett. I don't know if you know Leslie or
Yes.
not, but my agent and Leslie and I worked together to get the book into publisher ready form, and then my agent Keely Boving shopped it through Leslie to Lauren. And in almost no time, Lauren appears to have read the book, contacted both of them, and said, "I want this book," which, to an author, that is like saying, "Here, free money." I had been with smaller press during my earlier years. We all go through that. It's like the Beatles playing in the cavern or going to Hamburg. You got to put in your time. But the one thing that I don't enjoy about the process is publicizing one's books, going to all the little bookstores and begging them to put a few copies on the shelves, writing endless articles saying, "Listen to how smart I am." And Lauren said, "No, we'll do that." And so when I realized that he was the fiction arm of Texas A&M University Press Consortium, that was all it took for me. I would have done it for free just for him to take over the book and do the publicizing. Instead, he's actually agreed in some way to pay me. I'm not sure that'll ever happen, but I don't care. Lauren is a wonderful person to work for. I enjoy every minute I have with him. If I'm speaking to other potential authors, don't overlook Stony Creek. And if you have a chance to meet Lauren, meet him by all means. Just don't tell him to take any time away from the time he spends on my book.
Jack, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to find out any more about you, any more about your books. Certainly, purchase your books might be the best place or places for them to go.
Out of loyalty, I want to start with Texas A&M University Press. That is the host catalog for Stony Creek. You can go online to Texas A&M University Press and find the book and order it there. You certainly can order the book on Amazon. It's available at Barnes and Noble. It's available at Book People here in Austin, the Twig in San Antonio, Brazos in Houston, other independent bookstores around the state. It's certainly available through this wonderful website, which is named jwlbooks.com, which is mine. And that's a good place to learn about me. It's a good place to learn about Dangerous Latitudes and my other work. It's a good place to learn about what I do that is not writing connected, such as teaching the craft of writing to military veterans. It's just a place to hang out and visit. And I send out a newsletter if you'd like that. It's First Draft. Those are places I would enjoy visiting with you. My email is there. I answer my email.
Jack, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
I hope to see you again. Thanks, Tom.